March 7, 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy shipyard at Kobe. Vice Admiral Eisaburo Ozawa stood on the dock, his eyes fixed on the massive hull of Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced aircraft carrier. After 32 months of construction, she was finally ready for commissioning. 32 months of labor, of precious steel, of resources Japan could barely spare. The Vice Admiral should have felt pride. Instead, a cold dread settled in his chest. 3 days earlier, intelligence reports had crossed his desk. The Americans had just commissioned another Essex-Class carrier. That made 15 in barely 2 years. 15. Ozawa pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket and read the numbers again, though he had already memorized them. USS Essex, 20 months from keel to commissioning. USS Yorktown, 16.5 months. USS Intrepid, 17 months. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. Japan's newest flagship had taken longer to build than 2 American carriers combined. As Ozawa watched welders apply the final touches to Taiho's armored flight deck, he understood what many of his colleagues refused to accept. The war was not being lost in the skies over the Pacific. It was being lost in the shipyards of Newport News, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn. The Americans had achieved something Japan could never match: industrial velocity that defied comprehension. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of Japan's carrier construction crisis begins not in wartime desperation, but in pre-war confidence. Throughout the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had crafted a careful strategy for Pacific dominance. Their carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, represented the finest naval engineering Japan could produce. Each ship embodied years of design refinement, lessons learned from earlier vessels, and a commitment to quality over quantity. Japanese naval architects approached carrier design with meticulous attention to detail. The Shokaku-class carriers, commissioned in 1941, displaced 25,675 tons and could carry more than 70 aircraft. They were fast, capable of 34.5 knots, with a range of 9,500 nautical miles. Their construction took approximately 4 years from laying the keel to final commissioning. This timeline seemed reasonable, even admirable, for such complex vessels. But Japanese planners had made a fatal assumption. They believed the Americans would follow similar construction patterns. Traditional naval wisdom held that fleet carriers required 3 to 5 years to build. Complex propulsion systems, intricate armor schemes, sophisticated aircraft handling equipment, and the integration of thousands of components meant that rushing construction risked catastrophic failures. Every navy in the world operated under these constraints, or so the Japanese thought. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had been carefully calculated. By crippling the American battleship fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto hoped to buy Japan time, perhaps 6 months to a year, to consolidate their Pacific conquests before American industrial might could respond. Yamamoto himself had studied in the United States and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues. Yet even Yamamoto underestimated what was coming. The Battle of Midway, in June 1942, revealed the first cracks in Japanese naval supremacy. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, went to the bottom of the Pacific in a single day. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, these losses were catastrophic. These were not just ships, they were floating cities of specialized machinery, skilled workers, and institutional knowledge. Each carrier represented thousands of man-hours of construction, decades of accumulated expertise, and resources that could not be quickly replaced. Japanese naval leadership immediately authorized emergency carrier construction programs. The Taiho class would be Japan's answer to American carriers, ships with armored flight decks that could withstand bomb hits and continue operations. Additional Unryu-class carriers, based on the proven Hiryu design, would provide numbers. On paper, the plan looked promising. 14 new carriers were ordered between 1942 and 1943. What Japanese admirals did not yet fully grasp was the transformation occurring across the Pacific. In American shipyards, something unprecedented in naval history was taking shape. The Essex-Class construction program was not simply building carriers. It was industrializing carrier construction in ways that defied every assumption about how long such vessels should take to complete. The Essex-Class design had been finalized before Pearl Harbor in early 1941. Naval architects at the Bureau of Ships had created something remarkable, a carrier specifically designed for rapid mass production. Every design decision prioritized construction speed without sacrificing capability. The result was a ship that could be built with standardized components, simplified systems, and streamlined assembly processes. When USS Essex's keel was laid down on April 28, 1941, at Newport News Shipbuilding, the construction contract called for traditional timelines, but after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. The contract was reworked, priorities shifted, workers labored in multiple shifts, 7 days a week. The shipyard became a round-the-clock operation where thousands of welders, electricians, and fitters worked with ruthless efficiency. The statistics of Essex-class production reveal an industrial miracle. USS Essex, from keel laying to commissioning, took 20 months, but that was just the beginning. As shipyards refined their processes, construction times dropped even further. USS Yorktown, the second carrier, took 16.5 months. Some later carriers were completed in as little as 14 months from keel to commissioning. This was not an incremental improvement, it was a revolution. To understand the scale of this achievement, consider what an Essex-class carrier represented. Each ship displaced 27,500 tons at standard load, measured 872 feet in length, and stood over 150 feet from keel to mast top. They carried 90 to 100 aircraft, required nearly 3,000 crew members, and contained miles of electrical wiring, hundreds of compartments, sophisticated radar systems, powerful steam turbines, generating 150,000 shaft horsepower, and complex aircraft elevators that could move planes from hangar to flight deck in 15 seconds. Every Essex-class carrier contained approximately 12,000 tons of special treatment steel, a nickel-chromium alloy that provided armor protection while remaining fully structural. The flight deck alone measured nearly 860 feet long and 93 feet wide. Below deck, 2 massive hangars could accommodate dozens of aircraft. 4 Babcock and Wilcox boilers generated steam for Westinghouse turbines that drove 4 propeller shafts. The ships could steam at 33 knots and had an operational range of 20,000 nautical miles. Building such vessels in 14 to 20 months required complete reimagining of shipbuilding processes. American yards achieved this through multiple innovations. First, extensive use of prefabrication meant that major ship sections were built simultaneously in different parts of the shipyard, then lifted into place by massive cranes. Second, standardization of components across all Essex-class carriers meant that lessons learned on one ship immediately applied to all others under construction. Third, the use of electric welding instead of riveting significantly accelerated hull construction while creating stronger seams. Perhaps most critically, American shipyards had the infrastructure and workforce to support simultaneous construction of multiple carriers. Newport News, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia Navy Yard, and Norfolk Navy Yard all built Essex-class carriers concurrently. At the peak of production in 1943 and 1944, a new Essex-class carrier entered service approximately every 2 months. This rhythm of completion meant that as one carrier finished sea trials, another was launching, and yet another's keel was being laid. For Japanese naval intelligence officers analyzing these reports, the numbers seemed impossible. Initial assessments dismissed American production claims as propaganda, inflated figures, designed to demoralize Japanese forces. But as month after month passed, and American carrier strength visibly increased in Pacific waters, denial became impossible. The Americans were not exaggerating. If anything, their public statements understated the scale of their shipbuilding program. Japanese admirals began requesting detailed analyses of American construction methods. How were the Americans achieving such speed? Were they cutting corners, building inferior ships that would prove fragile in combat? Naval attaches in neutral countries gathered whatever intelligence they could. What they learned was sobering. The Essex-Class carriers were not only being built quickly, they were being built well. Early combat reports showed these ships could absorb tremendous damage and continue fighting. The contrast with Japanese carrier construction became increasingly painful. When Taiho's keel was laid in July 1941, less than 3 months before, USS Essex, Japanese planners expected her to be a war-winning weapon. The design was ambitious: an armoured flight deck, enhanced anti-aircraft batteries, improved damage control systems, and a displacement of 29,300 tons. She would be larger and theoretically more capable than any American carrier. But Taiho's construction dragged on. Material shortages plagued every stage. Special steel had to be diverted from other projects. Skilled workers were in short supply as military conscription pulled experienced shipwrights into the army. Air raids by American bombers, though still limited in 1942 and early 1943, disrupted production schedules. Most critically, Japan's industrial infrastructure simply lacked the capacity to mass-produce complex components at the speed required. By the time Taiho launched in April 1943, nearly 2 years after her keel laying, USS Essex had been in commission for 4 months and had already seen combat. By the time Taiho commissioned in March 1944, the Americans had commissioned 14 Essex-Class carriers. The race was not close. It was a humiliation. Japanese shipyards attempted to compensate with the WWII-class program. These carriers, based on the earlier Hiryu design, were supposed to be simpler and faster to build than fleet carriers like Taiho. Displacing 17,150 tons, the WWII class was smaller than both Taiho and the American Essex-Class. But smaller did not mean faster to construct. The first WWII-class carrier took nearly as long to build as an American fleet carrier. Of the 14 WWII-class carriers ordered, only 3 were ever completed, and only 1 saw combat operations. The others remained in various stages of construction, as material shortages, bombing raids, and resource allocation battles doomed the program. Each unfinished hull represented months of wasted labor and precious steel that could have gone to destroyers, submarines, or aircraft production. The carrier construction crisis had become a catastrophic drain on Japan's entire war economy. Admiral Ozawa, appointed commander of the mobile fleet in November 1943, understood the mathematics of defeat better than most. In staff meetings, he would sketch out the carrier balance on paper, showing his officers what they faced. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japan would deploy 9 carriers against 15 American fleet and light carriers. But those numbers told only part of the story. The American carriers were newer, better equipped, and supported by an industrial base that could replace losses within months. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, remembered by Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated the consequences of industrial imbalance. Japanese carriers launched attack waves only to see them decimated by American fighters guided by sophisticated radar. Of 373 Japanese aircraft launched, more than 300 were destroyed. American losses: 29 aircraft. But the carrier losses told an even more devastating story. Taiho, Admiral Ozawa's flagship, Japan's most modern carrier, completed just 3 months earlier, after 32 months of construction, was struck by a single torpedo from the submarine USS Albacore. Poor damage control and design flaws turned what should have been survivable damage into catastrophe. Hours later, aviation fuel vapors ignited in a massive explosion. Taiho sank, taking with her 1,650 crew members and the illusion that armoured carriers could protect Japan from American industrial might. In the same battle, Shokaku, one of the Pearl Harbor veterans, was torpedoed by USS Kavala and sank with 1,200 men. 2 fleet carriers lost in a single day, each representing years of construction, irreplaceable pilots, and resources Japan desperately needed elsewhere. Meanwhile, American carriers, despite being attacked, survived. The Essex-Class ships proved they could absorb punishment and keep fighting. After the Philippine Sea disaster, Japanese naval staff conducted brutally honest assessments. One report, later captured by American forces, stated with remarkable clarity, "The enemy's construction program exceeds our ability to inflict losses. For every carrier we sink, they commission 5. Our most optimistic projections show the Americans operating 30 fleet carriers by 1945. We have 3 operational fleet carriers and no capacity to build more." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The numbers were even worse than the report suggested. By mid-1945, the United States Navy would deploy 40 fleet and light carriers to the Pacific, more than Japan had possessed in its entire history. The Essex-Class alone would account for 17 fleet carriers in commission by war's end, with 7 more under construction or fitting out. Including escort carriers, America would operate over 150 carriers of all types. Japanese admirals who survived the war later wrote extensively about their realization of industrial defeat. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto and later commander of the 5th Air Fleet, kept a detailed diary throughout the war. His entries from late 1943 and 1944 reveal a man grappling with impossible mathematics. In one entry from October 1944, Ugaki wrote, "Intelligence reports, another American carrier commissioned this week. I no longer track their names. There are too many. We send our best pilots against their fleet, achieve hits, claim sinkings. Within weeks, the same number of carriers appear again. Either our pilots exaggerate their success, or the Americans build ships faster than we can sink them. I suspect both are true." Captain Toshikazu Omei, a staff officer in the Naval General Staff, was tasked with analyzing American carrier construction throughout the war. His reports make for sobering reading. In December 1943, he presented findings to senior admirals showing that American shipyards were completing Essex-Class carriers at a rate that would soon exceed the total number of carriers Japan had ever operated. His recommendation: negotiate peace before American numerical superiority became overwhelming. The recommendation was ignored. By that point, Japanese military culture had shifted from strategic calculation to desperate defiance. Admitting that the war was unwinnable due to industrial factors was seen as defeatism. Senior officers who suggested negotiation risked their careers, or worse. The Navy General Staff continued to plan offensive operations as if carrier parity could be achieved through superior tactics and pilot skill. But tactics could not overcome industrial reality. The kamikaze program, begun in October 1944, represented a final acknowledgement that conventional carrier aviation could no longer compete. If Japanese pilots could not defeat American carriers through skill and numbers, perhaps they could damage them through sacrifice. The desperate hope was that suicide attacks would sink carriers faster than American yards could replace them. It did not work. During the Okinawa campaign from April to June 1945, kamikaze attacks hit multiple American carriers. USS Franklin suffered catastrophic damage from bombs in March 1945, losing over 700 crew members. USS Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikazes in May, killing nearly 400 men. Both ships should have sunk. Their survival testified to superior damage control, redundant systems, and robust construction. More importantly, even when heavily damaged carriers withdrew for repairs, others took their place immediately. The Essex-Class design included numerous survivability features that Japanese carriers lacked. Armored bulkheads divided the hangar deck into 3 separate fire bays, preventing flames from spreading throughout the ship. Aviation fuel lines featured shut-off valves that could be remotely activated to prevent fuel from feeding fires. Firefighting equipment was positioned throughout the vessel, with trained damage control parties capable of responding within minutes. The ships could absorb hits that would have destroyed Japanese carriers and remain operational. Japanese naval architects studied captured intelligence about Essex-Class construction and design with a mixture of admiration and despair. The American approach to carrier construction reflected fundamentally different priorities. Where Japanese designers emphasized speed and offensive power, accepting vulnerability as the price for these qualities, American designers built carriers that could survive mistakes, absorb damage, and return to fight again. Part 2. Continuation. This philosophical difference extended to construction priorities. American shipyards prioritized completion speed because naval planners understood that numbers mattered more than perfection. A good carrier delivered in 14 months was more valuable than a perfect carrier delivered in 32 months. Japanese shipyards, constrained by limited resources and cultural expectations of craftsmanship, struggled to embrace this philosophy. The workforce disparity told its own story. At peak production, American shipyards employed over 2 million workers directly in naval construction. Women, previously excluded from heavy industrial work, became welders, electricians, and fitters. Entire training programs were created to transform civilians into skilled shipbuilders within weeks. The Brooklyn Navy Yard alone employed over 70,000 workers during the war, operating 3 shifts around the clock. Mare Island Shipyard, Newport News, and Philadelphia Navy Yard ran similar operations. Japanese shipyards, by contrast, faced constant labor shortages. Military conscription pulled experienced workers into combat units. Women were never integrated into heavy shipbuilding in significant numbers, reflecting cultural attitudes about appropriate work. Training programs existed but could not compensate for the fundamental shortage of bodies and the loss of institutional knowledge as experienced workers were drafted. Shipyards competed with aircraft factories, munitions plants, and the military itself for limited manpower. Material shortages compounded Japan's construction crisis. Steel production peaked in Japan in 1943 at approximately 7 million tons annually. This had to supply the entire war machine: ships, tanks, aircraft, weapons, and infrastructure. By comparison, American steel production in 1943 exceeded 80 million tons. The disparity was so vast that it rendered conventional naval competition meaningless. Specialized materials created additional bottlenecks: high-grade alloys for armor, precision bearings for propeller shafts, copper for electrical wiring, and rubber for seals, all required specific resources. American industry could source these globally, maintaining supply chains across the Atlantic and Pacific. Japanese industry, increasingly isolated by submarine warfare and air attacks, had to husband every resource. By 1944, Japanese carriers being fitted out received lower quality materials than pre-war vessels, compromising performance and reliability. The submarine campaign against Japanese shipping inflicted devastating damage on carrier construction. Steel could not be manufactured without iron ore, most of which came to Japan from the Asian mainland and Southeast Asian conquests. American submarines systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping, cutting off these supply lines. By 1944, raw material deliveries to Japanese industry had fallen to a fraction of wartime needs. Carriers sat partially complete in shipyards, waiting for steel that never arrived. Admiral Ozawa's staff prepared detailed analyses showing how submarine warfare had effectively ended Japan's carrier construction program. Even if shipyards could complete hulls, there was no fuel oil to power them, no aviation gasoline for their aircraft, and no replacement parts for their complex machinery. The carriers being built in 1944 and 1945 were, in a sense, elaborate monuments to industrial futility. American intelligence officers interrogating captured Japanese naval officers after the war were struck by how thoroughly Japanese leadership understood their predicament. These were not stupid men. They recognized American industrial superiority, but felt powerless to respond. One captured staff officer told interrogators, "We knew by 1943 we could not win. The question was not whether we would lose, but when and how completely." Every report about American carrier construction made this clearer, but suggesting surrender was impossible. So we fought on, knowing the outcome. This psychological dimension, the forced continuation of a war everyone knew was lost, helps explain the increasingly desperate tactics of Japan's final war years. The kamikaze program, human torpedoes, suicide submarines, and plans for defending the home islands through massive casualties all reflected the same calculation. If industrial competition was hopeless, perhaps spiritual determination could compensate. It could not. The final Essex-Class carriers, commissioned in 1945, entered a Pacific War already decided. USS Lake Champlain, commissioned in June 1945. USS Tarawa, commissioned in December 1945, months after Japan's surrender. These ships, built in the same shipyards using the same processes that had been refined over 4 years of production, represented the endpoint of industrial carrier construction. They were built faster, cheaper, and more efficiently than any previous carriers in history. Japanese naval personnel who witnessed Essex-Class carriers firsthand, either in combat or after surrender, consistently described feeling overwhelmed by their numbers and capability. Kamikaze pilots briefed before missions were shown reconnaissance photos of American task forces. The images revealed carrier after carrier, surrounded by cruisers and destroyers, stretching to the horizon. Pilots who survived missions and returned to base reported the same sight. Wherever they struck, more carriers appeared. The industrial disparity extended beyond mere numbers. American carriers operated with logistical support that Japanese carriers could never match. Fleet train vessels, mobile repair ships, and supply vessels kept American carriers operational for months without returning to port. Japanese carriers, by contrast, required frequent return to major naval bases for maintenance and resupply. This operational tempo difference meant that even when Japan had carriers, they could not sustain continuous operations the way American carriers could. Captain Ome, in his post-war writings, calculated that American carriers averaged 3 times as many operational days per year as Japanese carriers. This multiplier effect meant that Japan's numerical inferiority was even worse than raw carrier counts suggested. 6 operational Japanese carriers might provide the same total carrier days as 2 American carriers. The mathematics of attrition warfare became hopeless when one side could operate more continuously and replace losses faster. The Essex-Class construction program also demonstrated American industrial flexibility. As the war progressed and lessons were learned, modifications were incorporated into carriers still under construction. Beginning in March 1943, Essex-Class carriers were built with a longer bow, providing additional deck space and better seakeeping. Ships under construction received improved radar systems, enhanced anti-aircraft batteries, and upgraded damage control equipment. This ability to evolve the design while maintaining high production rates showcased American industrial sophistication. Japanese carriers, by contrast, were often obsolete before completion. Taiho, commissioned in March 1944, incorporated design elements conceived in 1939. 5 years of technological advancement meant she lacked the radar, damage control systems, and aircraft handling equipment that American carriers built in 1944 possessed as standard. The slow construction pace locked in obsolescence. After the war ended, American occupation forces documented Japanese naval construction facilities. The reports reveal the scale of the disparity. Major Japanese naval shipyards like Kure and Yokosuka were impressive facilities by pre-war standards, but compared to American yards, they were cramped, poorly equipped, and lacking in modern construction machinery. Japanese yards relied more heavily on manual labor, where American yards used cranes, power tools, and mechanized systems. One American naval architect inspecting Kure shipyard in September 1945 wrote, "The facilities here represent approximately 1920s technology in the United States. They have excellent craftsmen, but limited machinery. Everything takes longer because more must be done by hand. I estimate that with these facilities, building an Essex-Class carrier would require 5 to 6 years minimum, assuming all materials were available. They never had a chance." This assessment was not meant cruelly, but as honest technical evaluation. Japanese industrial capacity in 1941 was approximately 10% of American capacity. No amount of courage, superior tactics, or better training could overcome a 10-to-1 disadvantage in industrial output. When that disparity applied to carrier construction, the results were predetermined. Vice Admiral Ozawa, who survived the war and was interrogated extensively by American intelligence, provided perhaps the most candid assessment. Asked when he realized Japan could not win the carrier war, he replied, "I began to understand at Midway in 1942, when we lost 4 carriers, but I fully grasped it in 1944 when your Essex-Class carriers appeared in such numbers. By Philippine Sea, I commanded 9 carriers against your 15. This seemed like reasonable odds, but I knew you had more carriers arriving monthly while I would receive no more. The battle had already been lost in your shipyards." Ozawa continued, "Your Essex-Class carriers were not individually superior to our best ships. Taiho had an armoured flight deck, something your carriers lacked. Shokaku and Zuikaku were excellent ships, but you had 15 carriers where we had 9, and next month you would have 17 where we might have 8. Within a year, you would have 30 where we would have 3. This is not a war that can be won through superior tactics, it is mathematics." These mathematical realities were apparent to junior officers as well. Ensign Haruo Yoshino, who served aboard the carrier Zuikaku until her sinking in October 1944, later wrote, "We knew from American radio broadcasts how many carriers you were building. Some officers said these were lies, propaganda. But we saw the evidence in every battle, new carriers with different numbers and names. Your carriers seemed infinite. Ours disappeared one by one, never to be replaced. By 1944, every Japanese naval aviator understood we were fighting not just the American fleet, but American industry. And American industry could not be sunk. The psychological impact of facing an enemy with apparently limitless industrial capacity cannot be overstated. Japanese naval personnel had been raised in a culture that emphasized spirit over material, determination over resources, and willingness to die over pragmatic calculation. These cultural values had merit in many contexts, but they proved catastrophically mismatched against an enemy who could replace every loss and exceed every production target. American factories, shipyards, and training facilities operated with assembly line logic. Workers were interchangeable, trained quickly, and organized efficiently. Individual excellence mattered less than systematic process. This approach, so foreign to Japanese military culture, proved devastatingly effective. The Essex-Class program succeeded because it was not dependent on genius or heroism. It was dependent on organization, resources, and ruthless efficiency. The final tally tells the story completely. From 1941 to 1945, the United States commissioned 24 Essex-Class fleet carriers. Japan commissioned 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Unryu, Amagi, and Katsuragi if light carriers are included. The last Japanese carrier commissioned was Katsuragi in October 1944. After that date, Japan launched no more carriers, while America continued commissioning Essex-Class carriers into 1946. None of the Essex-Class carriers were lost to enemy action during the war, though several sustained severe damage. This survival rate testified both to their robust construction and to American damage control excellence. By contrast, all major Japanese carriers commissioned during the war were sunk: Taiho, Shinano, Unryu, and others. The attrition rate was not sustainable, nor could it be reversed. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the carrier balance was so lopsided that it barely mattered. American carrier aircraft dominated the skies over Japan itself, striking at will against military and industrial targets. Japanese carriers, those few that remained, were hiding in harbors or stripped of fuel and aircraft. The Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force months before formal surrender. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Part 3. The Aftermath and Legacy. In the weeks following Japan's surrender, American naval intelligence teams fanned out across the Japanese home islands, documenting what remained of the Imperial Japanese Navy's infrastructure. What they found confirmed everything the numbers had suggested. In shipyards across Japan, partially completed carrier hulls sat rusting, abandoned mid-construction, when materials ran out or priorities shifted. These skeletal remains told stories of industrial desperation. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, inspectors found the incomplete hull of what would have been another Unryu-class carrier. Construction had stopped in early 1945, when steel allocations were diverted to building kamikaze boats and coastal defense positions. The hull was perhaps 40% complete, representing thousands of man-hours and tons of precious steel that had produced nothing useful for Japan's war effort. Similar scenes repeated at Kure, Sasebo, and other naval facilities. The contrast with American shipyards was stark. In the United States, as the war ended, multiple Essex-Class carriers were in various stages of completion. Rather than abandoning these hulls, American yards completed most of them, though at a reduced pace. Some were commissioned months after the war ended, joining a peacetime navy that would dominate the Pacific for decades. The industrial machine that had overwhelmed Japan did not simply stop. It transitioned to peacetime production without missing a beat. Lieutenant Commander Kyozo Ohashi, a former naval constructor who had worked on Taiho's design, was interviewed extensively by American technical intelligence teams. His testimony provides remarkable insight into Japanese awareness of their industrial limitations. Ohashi explained that Japanese naval architects had studied American shipbuilding techniques as early as 1942, trying to understand how the Essex-class construction proceeded so rapidly. "We obtained photographs of your shipyards through neutral sources," Ohashi told his interrogators. "What we saw was shocking. Entire ship sections prefabricated in massive assembly buildings, then moved by railway cranes to the slipway. Your yards looked like automobile factories, not traditional shipyards. We understood the principle, standardization allowing parallel construction of components, but we could not replicate it. We lacked the cranes, the assembly buildings, the trained workforce, and most critically, we lacked the steel to build multiple carriers simultaneously." Ohashi continued, describing Japanese attempts to accelerate construction. "In 1943, we proposed building a simplified carrier design that could be completed in 18 months. The design eliminated armor, reduced speed, simplified propulsion. It would carry perhaps 50 aircraft. Even this proved impossible. The simplified design still required materials we did not have and worker hours we could not spare. The program was cancelled after 3 months of planning. We concluded that Japan would never match American carrier construction speed regardless of design choices. This realization, that the war was industrially unwinnable, created profound psychological pressure within Japanese naval leadership. Officers who understood the mathematics faced a terrible choice: speak honestly about Japan's situation and risk being branded defeatist, or remain silent and watch their nation march toward inevitable defeat. Most chose silence, though private diaries and correspondence reveal their inner turmoil. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet from late 1942 through early 1944, kept extensive notes on carrier construction that were captured after the war. His writings reveal a man trying desperately to find solutions where none existed. In one entry from March 1943, Fukudome calculated that even if Japan completed all planned carrier construction on schedule, which he knew was impossible, they would have approximately 12 fleet carriers by 1946. His intelligence indicated America would have 40 by that date. "The disparity is beyond addressing through tactical innovation," Fukudome wrote. "We require a strategic breakthrough. Either negotiate peace while we retain some strength, or develop weapons that can neutralize carrier superiority. The former is politically impossible, the latter may be technically impossible. Therefore, we continue preparing for battles we cannot win, hoping for miracles that will not come. These miracles never materialized. The weapons programs Fukudome referenced, jet aircraft and guided missiles among them, remained undeveloped or ineffective. Japan's industrial base could not support the kind of advanced weapons development that might have offset numerical inferiority. Meanwhile, American industry not only built carriers in unprecedented numbers, but also continuously improved aircraft, radar, weapons, and support systems. The post-war interrogations of Japanese admirals provided American intelligence with comprehensive understanding of how thoroughly Japan had recognized its industrial defeat. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had proposed the kamikaze program, stated bluntly during interrogation, "The suicide attacks were born from industrial despair. If we could not replace carriers and trained pilots faster than you destroyed them, perhaps we could damage your carriers faster than you could repair them." This was never a viable strategy. It was desperation masquerading as tactics. Onishi's words reflected a broader truth about Japan's final war strategy. The kamikaze program, the emphasis on decisive battle, the planning for homeland defense through mass civilian mobilization, all these reflected awareness that conventional military competition had become impossible. When industrial capacity determines victory, the side with less capacity must either surrender or resort to increasingly desperate measures. Japan chose desperation. The human cost of this industrial disparity extended far beyond combat casualties. Japanese naval shipyard workers labored under increasingly difficult conditions as the war progressed. Material shortages meant welders often had to reuse steel from scrapped ships. Bombing raids disrupted work and killed workers. Food rationing weakened labor forces. By 1945, workers in Japanese naval yards were malnourished, exhausted, and demoralized, building ships they knew would never be completed. American shipyard workers, by contrast, worked long hours, but were well-fed, well-paid, and motivated by genuine belief in their contribution to victory. The social and economic conditions that enabled American industrial success were as important as the technical capabilities. Well-fed workers are more productive. Motivated workers make fewer mistakes. Adequate resources allow focus on quality rather than just survival. The strategic implications of the carrier construction disparity extended beyond World War II. American dominance in carrier construction established patterns that shaped naval power for decades. The Essex-Class carriers, built so rapidly during wartime, continued serving through the 1960s and 70s. Some were modernized multiple times, receiving angled flight decks, steam catapults, and upgraded electronics. Their robust construction and thoughtful design allowed adaptation to jet aircraft and changing mission requirements. USS Lexington, an Essex-class carrier commissioned in February 1943, served for 48 years before final decommissioning in November 1991. Nearly 5 decades of service from a ship built in 18 months. This longevity testified to both construction quality and the enormous industrial capacity that built these carriers, without cutting corners or sacrificing durability for speed. The lessons Japanese naval officers drew from their carrier construction defeat influenced post-war Japanese naval policy profoundly. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, established in the 1950s, initially focused on destroyers and submarines rather than attempting to rebuild carrier capabilities. The industrial trauma of World War II's carrier construction competition left lasting institutional memory. Even as Japan's economy recovered and became one of the world's largest, Japanese naval planners remained cautious about carrier construction. For American naval strategists, the Essex-class program became a case study in how industrial capacity enables military power. The ships themselves served in Korea, Vietnam, and countless peacetime deployments. But the real legacy was demonstrating that properly organized industrial capacity could produce complex warships faster than enemies could destroy them. This principle, industrial production outpacing attrition, became fundamental to American Cold War strategy. The story of Japanese admirals examining Essex-class construction and conceding they could never match the speed reveals something profound about World War II in the Pacific. The war was decided not by any single battle, not by tactical innovation or superior courage, but by industrial mathematics so lopsided that no amount of determination could overcome it. Japanese admirals were not blind to this reality. They understood, they calculated, they recognized defeat was inevitable. But understanding, industrial inferiority, and being able to address it are entirely different challenges. In retrospect, Japan's decision to initiate war against the United States appears even more catastrophic when carrier construction is examined. Japanese planners knew American industrial capacity exceeded their own. Yamamoto's famous statement that he could run wild for 6 months to a year implicitly acknowledged that longer conflicts favored America. What Japanese leadership failed to grasp was how quickly American industrial superiority would manifest in carrier production. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's carrier strength remained roughly equal to American carrier strength in the Pacific. 12 months after Pearl Harbor, America had begun pulling ahead. 24 months after Pearl Harbor, American numerical superiority was becoming overwhelming. By 36 months after Pearl Harbor, the carrier balance was so lopsided that Japanese carriers barely factored into American operational planning. The speed of this transition, from parity to hopeless inferiority, shocked Japanese leadership. Captain Toshikazu Omai, whose intelligence analyses had warned of American construction capabilities, wrote bitterly after the war about how his reports had been received. I presented data showing American shipyards could build Essex-Class carriers in 16 to 20 months. Senior officers dismissed this as impossible. They believed I had been deceived by American propaganda. When I showed photographs of multiple carriers under simultaneous construction, they suggested the photographs were fabricated. When carriers bearing the names I had predicted appeared in battle, they claimed these were old carriers renamed. Denial was more comfortable than accepting reality. This institutional denial, the refusal to believe what intelligence clearly showed, represented its own kind of strategic failure. Even when Japanese leadership possessed accurate information about American industrial capacity, cultural and political factors prevented appropriate response. Admitting that the war was unwinnable due to industrial factors would have required acknowledging that the decision to start the war had been fundamentally flawed. This was psychologically and politically unacceptable to many senior officers and government officials. The mathematical realities of carrier construction were reinforced by pilot training disparities. Even if Japan had somehow matched American carrier construction, which was impossible, they could not match pilot training. American training programs produced thousands of adequately trained pilots. Japanese training programs, constrained by fuel shortages and limited aircraft, produced fewer pilots with less training. By 1944, American carrier pilots averaged over 300 hours of flight training before combat. Japanese replacement pilots often had fewer than 100 hours. This pilot quality gap meant that even when Japan had carriers, they could not be effectively employed. Carriers without skilled pilots are merely expensive targets. The combination of numerical carrier inferiority and pilot quality decline created a death spiral from which recovery was impossible. Each battle consumed irreplaceable experienced pilots. Replacements were less skilled, less effective, and more likely to be killed quickly. This attrition, combined with inability to replace carriers, doomed Japanese naval aviation. American carriers, by contrast, benefited from ever-improving pilot quality. The training pipeline continuously refined techniques based on combat experience. Replacement pilots arriving at carriers in 1944 and 1945 were better trained than their predecessors. This quality improvement, combined with numerical superiority, created compounding advantages. Better pilots survived longer, shared knowledge with newer pilots, and executed missions more effectively. The industrial dimension also affected carrier maintenance and repair. American carriers damaged in battle could withdraw to massive repair facilities at Pearl Harbor, Puget Sound, or even return to their construction yards for comprehensive repairs. These facilities had the equipment, materials, and skilled workers to restore heavily damaged carriers to full operational status within months. Japanese carriers damaged in battle faced much longer repair periods in facilities that lacked adequate parts, materials, and equipment. USS Franklin, hit by bombs off Okinawa in March 1945, suffered catastrophic damage. Over 700 crew members died, her flight deck was wrecked, and fires raged throughout the ship. Yet she steamed under her own power to New York, underwent repairs, and was returned to service. The ability to repair such damage spoke to both ship design and industrial support infrastructure. Japanese carriers suffering similar damage would likely have been written off as total losses. The strategic calculus this created was devastating for Japan. American carriers could take risks, knowing damage could be repaired. Japanese carriers had to be husbanded carefully because damage might be irreparable. This risk calculus affected tactics, operational planning, and ultimately effectiveness. An asset you cannot afford to lose is an asset you cannot fully employ. American carriers were assets American could afford to risk. Japanese carriers were not. These dynamics reached their logical conclusion in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining surface fleet to a desperate gamble aimed at destroying American invasion forces in the Philippines. The plan relied on using Japan's remaining carriers as decoys, deliberately sacrificing them to draw American carriers away from the landing beaches. That Japanese carriers had been reduced to decoy status, mere bait to be sacrificed, illustrated how completely carrier roles had reversed since Pearl Harbor. The 4 Japanese carriers employed as decoys, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, carried fewer than 100 aircraft among them, lacking sufficient pilots to fill their capacity. American carriers, by contrast, deployed over 1,000 aircraft. The numerical disparity had become so extreme that Japanese carriers no longer posed meaningful offensive threat. They were targets, expensive and symbolic, but militarily irrelevant. All 4 were sunk. Their sacrifice achieved nothing. American carriers continued operations unimpeded. This battle, more than any other, demonstrated the final consequences of carrier construction disparity. Japan had begun the war with the world's most experienced carrier force, doctrine, and pilots. By October 1944, Japanese carriers were reduced to expendable decoys, while American carriers dominated Pacific operations. The transformation took less than 3 years, driven primarily by industrial capacity to build carriers faster than Japan could replace losses. Part 4. Continuation. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who assumed command of the combined fleet in May 1944, inherited an impossible situation. His predecessors, Yamamoto and Koga, had at least commanded fleets with offensive potential. Toyoda commanded remnants, survivors, and increasingly desperate plans. In his first strategic assessment, he counted 9 operational carriers against intelligence reports, showing 23 American carriers in the Pacific. The number grew monthly. His staff meetings became exercises in mathematical futility. One captured document from Toyoda's headquarters, dated July 1944, reveals the mindset of Japanese naval leadership at this stage. The document, a tactical assessment prepared for senior officers, stated, "Enemy carrier strength now exceeds our most pessimistic projections from 1942. Each engagement confirms they possess reserve strength we cannot match. Pilots report attacking carrier groups, inflicting damage, only to encounter the same number of carriers weeks later. Either our attack assessments are systematically wrong, or the enemy replaces losses at rates we previously thought impossible. Evidence suggests both are true." This assessment highlighted another dimension of the carrier crisis, the difficulty Japanese intelligence faced in accurately tracking American carrier strength. American carriers moved constantly, appeared in unexpected locations, and were supported by sophisticated deception operations. Japanese reconnaissance often identified the same carrier in multiple locations, leading to inflated estimates. But even when intelligence officers corrected for these errors, the true numbers remained overwhelming. The Americans aided this confusion deliberately. Carrier names were widely publicized, but their movements were carefully obscured. Radio deception, false traffic patterns, and deliberate leaks of misinformation made tracking individual carriers nearly impossible. Japanese intelligence might correctly identify USS Essex operating near the Philippines, while intercepted radio traffic suggested USS Lexington was also in the area, and reconnaissance reported a third unidentified carrier. Were these 3 different carriers or the same carrier reported multiple times? The confusion was intentional and effective, but confusion about specific carrier locations mattered less than the underlying reality. Whether Japan faced 18 carriers or 23 in a given operation, they were hopelessly outnumbered. The Essex-Class construction program had achieved what Japanese planners thought impossible. Building fleet carriers faster than combat could destroy them while simultaneously maintaining quality and capability. The technical sophistication of Essex-Class carriers revealed itself in countless small details that Japanese naval personnel noticed when examining captured documents or interviewing American prisoners. American carriers featured redundant electrical systems, meaning damage to one circuit did not disable entire sections. Japanese carriers often had single-path electrical distribution, making them vulnerable to cascading failures. American carriers had multiple fire mains, allowing damage control parties to fight fires from various locations. Japanese carriers had fewer fire mains, making firefighting more difficult when systems were damaged. These engineering details, seemingly minor, accumulated into decisive advantages. When USS Franklin burned off Okinawa, her crew fought fires for hours using equipment positioned throughout the ship. When Taiho suffered her fatal torpedo hit, poor ventilation allowed aviation fuel vapors to accumulate. A single spark triggered explosions that tore through the ship. Better ventilation design might have saved her. The difference between survival and destruction often came down to engineering choices made years earlier in design offices. Japanese naval constructors recognized these advantages but could not replicate them quickly enough. Redesigning ventilation systems or electrical distribution required time and resources. By the time improved designs were drafted, the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where carrier construction itself was being abandoned. The final Japanese carriers built incorporated few lessons from American designs because there was no time or capacity to implement them. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a damage control officer who survived 3 carrier sinkings, provided revealing testimony during post-war interrogation. After Taiho sank, I studied American carrier design through intelligence reports. Your carriers had advantages we never incorporated. But I understood why. Our carriers were designed for offensive power, accepting vulnerability to maximize strike capability. Your carriers were designed for sustained operations, building in redundancy and survivability. The philosophical difference reflected strategic assumptions. We expected short, decisive battles. You prepared for long campaigns of attrition. When the war became attritional, our design philosophy ensured defeat. Abe's analysis captured a profound truth. Japanese carrier design optimized for scenarios where Japan's advantages in pilot quality and tactical surprise could achieve quick victories. American carrier design optimized for scenarios where industrial capacity would enable sustained operations despite losses. When the war's character matched American assumptions rather than Japanese assumptions, Japanese carriers were revealed as fundamentally unsuited for the conflict they were fighting. This design philosophy difference extended to aircraft capacity. Japanese carriers often operated more aircraft than their hangars could fully accommodate, parking planes on deck. This maximized strike power but created vulnerability. Planes on deck were exposed to weather, damage, and could not be protected during battle. American carriers, with larger hangars and deck parks designed into their structure, could protect more aircraft while maintaining operational flexibility. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942 illustrated these design trade-offs. Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, launched massive strikes that damaged USS Hornet fatally and damaged USS Enterprise. But both Japanese carriers suffered damage that required months of repair. Shokaku limped back to Japan, spending 6 months in dock receiving repairs. During those 6 months, the Americans commissioned 5 new Essex-Class carriers. The tactical victory became strategic defeat. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Japanese carriers achieved tactical successes at Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and other battles. But every engagement caused damage requiring lengthy repairs. American carriers damaged in the same battles returned to action much faster. USS Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea in May 1942, underwent emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor and fought at Midway 3 days later. The speed of repair reflected not just urgency but infrastructure. Pearl Harbor's dry docks, workshops, and supply depots could accomplish in days what took Japanese facilities weeks. By 1944, even this repair advantage became moot for Japan. Damaged carriers sat in harbours not because repairs were slow, but because there were no resources to repair them. Steel went to more pressing needs. Skilled workers had been drafted. Parts could not be manufactured. The carrier, Zuikaku, damaged multiple times throughout 1943 and 1944, spent more time under repair than operational. She was sunk at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, ending the career of the last Pearl Harbor veteran carrier. American submarines deserve credit for exacerbating Japan's carrier construction crisis. Submarine warfare against Japanese merchant shipping strangled the flow of raw materials to shipyards. Iron ore from China, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, all the resources needed for carrier construction travelled by sea. American submarines systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping, cutting these supply lines. By mid-1944, more tonnage of shipping was being sunk than Japan could construct to replace it. The submarine campaign affected carrier construction both directly and indirectly. Directly, submarines sank ships carrying steel, copper, and other materials needed for carrier hulls. Indirectly, submarine warfare forced Japan to divert construction capacity to building convoy escorts, submarine chasers, and replacement merchant ships. Every destroyer built for convoy escort was a destroyer not available for fleet operations. Every ton of steel used for merchant ship construction was steel unavailable for carriers. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the U.S. submarine force in the Pacific, understood his mission's strategic impact. In reports to Pacific Fleet Headquarters, he emphasized that sinking merchant ships contributed as much to victory as sinking warships. Each tanker destroyed meant less fuel for Japanese industry. Each ore carrier sunk meant less steel for shipyards. The cumulative effect strangled Japanese war production, including carrier construction. Japanese naval leadership recognized submarine warfare's devastating impact, but could not counter it effectively. Japan had never developed effective anti-submarine warfare doctrine or equipment. Depth charges were less powerful than American models. Sonar was less capable. Training was inadequate. Most critically, Japan lacked the industrial capacity to build escort vessels in sufficient numbers. The same industrial limitations that prevented carrier construction also prevented building the escorts needed to protect shipping that supplied carrier construction. This interdependence created vicious cycles. Fewer escorts meant more merchant ship losses, which meant fewer materials for construction, which meant fewer escorts could be built, which meant more merchant losses. By 1944, Japanese merchant shipping losses exceeded 50% of capacity. Many merchant ships refused to sail without heavy escort, but heavy escort was unavailable. Materials sat in warehouses in Singapore, Jakarta, and Shanghai, unable to reach Japanese factories. The human dimension of these industrial struggles deserves recognition. Japanese shipyard workers labored under increasingly desperate conditions. Food rations declined as submarine warfare reduced imports. Air raids disrupted work and destroyed facilities. By 1945, workers at Kure Naval Arsenal were malnourished and exhausted, working 12-hour shifts on minimal food. Productivity declined as physical capacity weakened. Yet they continued, working, building ships they suspected would never be completed, driven by duty, fear, or simple lack of alternatives. American shipyard workers faced none of these hardships. Food was abundant. Working conditions, while demanding, included safety equipment, reasonable hours with overtime pay, and the knowledge that their labor contributed to winning the war. Rosie the Riveter, the iconic image of women workers in American war industries, represented millions of workers who built the Essex-Class carriers. These workers were well-trained, well-equipped, and motivated by genuine belief in their contribution. The contrast in working conditions reflected the contrast in national resources. America could afford to keep workers healthy, well-fed, and reasonably rested because food production was abundant, medical care was available, and the homeland was safe from attack. Japan could not provide these conditions because resources were scarce, medical care was limited, and the homeland faced increasing bombardment. Industrial capacity requires more than factories and steel. It requires healthy workers operating in secure environments, By early 1945, American carrier task forces operated within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. Carrier aircraft struck at will against industrial targets, including naval shipyards. Yokosuka, Kure, and Sasebo all suffered repeated air attacks. Partially completed carrier hulls were damaged or destroyed in their slipways. The final irony: American carriers built in 14 to 20 months were now destroying Japanese carriers that had taken 3 years to build and would never be completed. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel was devastating. Sailors who had trained their entire careers for carrier operations watched their profession become obsolete. Pilots with thousands of flight hours found themselves grounded because no carriers remained operational. Shipyard workers saw their labor destroyed by bombs before ships could launch. The collapse was not just military, it was professional, personal, and total. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, exemplified this psychological collapse. By 1945, Fuchida was assigned to staff duties, planning operations that could not be executed because no carriers remained to launch them. He later wrote, "I planned the attack that began the carrier war in the Pacific. By war's end, I planned imaginary operations for non-existent carriers. The circle was complete. We had destroyed the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor, forcing them to rely on carriers. They built carriers faster than we could comprehend. Now their carriers destroyed our shipyards, preventing us from building more carriers. We had created our own defeat." This reflection captured the tragic irony of Japan's carrier war. The Pearl Harbor attack, intended to cripple American naval power, instead forced America to revolutionize carrier operations and construction. The forced adaptation proved more powerful than the original attack. Japan had struck at American battleships and awakened an industrial juggernaut that overwhelmed them with carriers. The final accounting of carrier construction reveals the magnitude of American achievement. From 1941 through 1945, American shipyards laid down 32 Essex-Class carriers. 24 were commissioned during or immediately after the war. The remaining 8 were either cancelled or completed post-war. This represents the most successful mass production of fleet carriers in history. No nation before or since has matched this achievement. Japan, during the same period, laid down 14 fleet carriers of various classes. 6 were completed and commissioned. The others were cancelled, scrapped incomplete, or destroyed before completion. Of the 6 completed carriers, all were sunk before war's end. The attrition rate was 100%. Not a single Japanese fleet carrier completed during the war survived to surrender.